you very much, Jamie. A pleasure to be here again at the Center for Ethics Emerging Scholar session. I was here for the first session, which was in 2019. So I'm very happy to come back in here. And 2 years ago, when I was a PhD student still, I was just presenting some of the literature of data annotation and crowdsourcing and all the words that are associated with it, like ghost work, like micro work, and so on. So I'm happy here to be back with now 2 years later, with to present some of my research, ongoing research with all of you. So today I'm going to talk about embeddedness, which is a concept that I'm going to define later. Disembeddedness as well for data annotation for machine learning. But first, I'm going to talk about what is this data annotation, like where in AI is this data annotation happening? Some of you may be familiar with this. This is Kate Crawford's and Bladen Joler's Anatomy of an AI System. Here, what these authors did was to map for the Alexa system all the labor, resources, and the infrastructures used to create devices for artificial intelligence, process the data for the models, and then dispose of these devices. And this is a very complex graphic, but very briefly to describe it, on the left, the line that you go rising up is all the process to create the devices that support artificial intelligence. In the case of the Alexa, to create the Echo Dot. And then on the right is the disposal of these devices. So everything originates in the earth with the minerals and then the assemblies and so on until you get the products, and then it's disposed and it goes back to the landfills to when it gets recycled or then disposed back to the earth. And in the middle, you have all that has to do with the data. From the capturing of data for the Echo Dot, then all the internet infrastructures to the servers of the company, in this case, Amazon, and then all the neural networks that are used to train the system and the data sets that are used to train the system. So in all of this big anatomy and all this thing, anatomy of an AI system, what is my research and what is this talk that where is this talk situated? And it's in here, this little square in here. I'm going to zoom in now. And it's the data preparation and labeling. So this data preparation and labeling, according to the authors, occur in 4 different ways: through non-human labor, through professionals, unpaid or low-paid labor, and then the unrecognized labor of users. And among all of these, this talk is going to be about just these 2 lines, what they call crowd workers and outsourced services in developing countries. But here we call it also data annotation. So very briefly, all these data preparation and labeling, how does it interact with the model? So for a machine learning model, you need data for it to learn and produce an output. And there are 3 ways that workers are required to train these models. For the data part, many workers are required to create data sets. So that's the job called data entry that many workers do. Then many paradigms of machine learning, many types of doing machine learning rely on annotated data sets for the machine to learn. So that process of annotation is actually one of the largest or one of the main ways for workers are asked or tasked in these platforms. Data annotation is basically labeling images, categorizing images, doing semantic segmentation of images. I'm going to talk more about this later on. And then for the output, the algorithm will produce an output, and then many of the workers are also tasked with the verification of this output and the evaluation of this output. I'm also going to talk about more of these types of data in detail later. But first, let's talk about history, just to situate this type of work. Some of you might be familiar with this, is the Turk. It was an automaton that was paraded in the course of Europe in the late 17th, early 18th century. And what this automaton would do would be to play chess and defeat people at chess in these courts. And people were amazed about it. They didn't know how this robot automaton will function, but actually what was happening was there was a human concealed inside of the automaton who would actually make all the movements for the automaton, and the automaton will apparently, like, where everyone who was not looking at the inside would think that the automaton was moving on its own, but actually there was a human operating it from the inside. And that's why the most popular platform that we hear today for data annotation and labeling, it's called Amazon Mechanical Turk. That was the evil genius of Jeff Bezos, who thought that this platform would do the same, conceal, invisibilize all the workers that are hidden and actually operating, labeling, annotating, verifying the data sets for machine learning, and people will only see the Turk, would only see the platform and not the human concealed inside. But actually, if you look historically at this type of labor where people are actually paid by the piece, it has existed for centuries. And actually, I was looking at Karl Marx on the Capital. He defines many things about how capitalism and labor operates. And there's a passage in Capital where he talks about this type of work where you're paid by the piece. And this is a long quote I'm going to read with you, but you'll see why it's fundamental to see this historical. So this is within the 19th century and how it still operates today, and how this description of labor back in the day still applies for the labor that is used to train artificial intelligence and to verify its outputs. So this is Marx saying, let us consider a little more closely the characteristic peculiarities of piece wages. The quality of the labor is here controlled by the work itself, which must be of average perfection if the piece price is to be paid in full. Piece wages become, from this point of view, the most fruitful source of reduction of wages and capitalistic cheating. Piece wages lay the foundation of a modern domestic labor, described above, as well as a hierarchical organized system of exploitation and oppression. The latter two has two fundamental forms. On the one hand, piece wages facilitate the interposition of parasites between the capitalist and the wage labor, the subletting of labor. The gain of these middlemen comes entirely from the difference between the labor price, which the capitalist pays, and the part of that price which they actually allow to reach the labor. On the other hand, piece wage allows the capitalist to make a contract for so much per piece with the head, at a price for which the head laborer himself undertakes the enlisting and payment of his assistant work people. The exploitation of the laborer by capital is here effected through the exploitation of the laborer by the laborer. So here I have highlighted the most important parts of this long quotation. And I think the most important, the one that strikes me the most is in the third paragraph. You see middlemen, the middlemen. So the capitalist has need for labor. The capitalist pays the middleman, and the middleman find the workers. And here is the definition of what we have today as platforms. Platforms as intermediaries in a multi-sided market between different ends, including the clients, the requesters of the labor, and the workers. And also you have this hierarchical organized system of oppression and exploitation, as well as reduction of wages for the workers. And the final, these three things I'm going to discuss them today. The final one, I'm going to leave it towards the end of this talk, which is the exploitation of the labor by the laborer. So as you can see from this quote, within the 19th century, piece wage is old, centuries old. And this is an example of piece wage that has been recorded in these photographs. It's women and children working with garments from their home. Well, the men would go to the factories, the women and children would stay at home working per piece wage from their homes. So you can see here still how old is this division of labor. There's also gendered, and here vulnerable populations, women and children, are actually the ones working for this type of work. So to conceptualize commodification, this type of exploitation, I'm using the notions of embeddedness and social reproduction. For today's talk, I'm going to focus on the first one, just embeddedness. But I'm showing this to you is that one of the objectives of my dissertation, my research, is to explore in which ways embeddedness and social reproduction are interrelated. So I'm going to define embeddedness in a while, but social reproduction is basically the reproduction of society in the terms of social hierarchies, but also reproductive bodies. Bataracha, one of the scholars of social reproduction, defines it that labor scholars would usually look at what happens between 9 to 5 in a job office. Social reproduction is what happens between 5 to 9, where the workers live, where they have been educated, what type of services they have access to, how do they eat, and so on. So basically the idea that people exist in bodies. It's an embodied form of labor that needs to be reproduced and taken care of by society and a social structure. So this is social reproduction. And then embeddedness actually has two different meanings that can be reconciled in a moment. So first of all, embeddedness is a notion that comes from the thinking of Karl Polanyi. And Polanyi actually talks about embeddedness in his work from two different ways, what some authors have defined as soft Polanyi and hard Polanyi. So I'm going to describe them separately and then see how they actually are interrelated. So soft Polanyi, which some other authors call networked embeddedness, is the idea that economic activity is always embedded and enmeshed in institutions, economic and non-economic. Basically saying that a market is not only a transaction between one entity and the other, but these entities are embedded in these institutions, economic and non-economic, and embedded in society. Then some authors have developed this notion further, and there are one micro and micro level of this embeddedness. So the micro level was explored by Granovetter as personal embeddedness, the idea that social actors prefer to rely on personal sources and communications that they trust. And societal embeddedness, to look at it from the macro level, the idea that social actors are influenced by the institutional, social, and cultural context in which they are located. Then the second notion is normative embeddedness, of what some authors call hard Polanyi. It's about commodification. So Polanyi thought that labor, land, and money are fictitious commodities, meaning they were not created by the market. Remember that before I said that workers are actually embodied, they're human beings that require protection, care, that have human rights. So they're fictitious commodities in the sense that if you actually would transact humans purely as commodities, that would be called slavery. So you see that labor, land, and money are fictitious commodities, especially labor in the sense of that because they're embodied workers, human beings that are protected by law and by society and have rights. So Polanyi argues that macro level legal, normative, and cultural constraints limit this commodification. And this is tied to power relations in the market and how this, again, normative, cultural, and legal constraints constrain these powers actually to take hold of the commodification and gain and exploit this labor as a commodity. Then this notion was later revealed by economic sociologists. For example, Burawoy argues that economic labor becomes disembedded from society, and its characters, when it happens, the character and use value becomes destroyed. So the idea that labor, embodied labor, when commodified, the use value of this labor becomes destroyed. And then again, back to Polanyi would argue that historically we see periods of decommodification and then commodification according to, again, legal, normative, and cultural constraints. And for example, right now we're experiencing, since the neoliberal reforms in the 80s, a new era of commodification of labor. And this era has developed until what we have today, labor platforms, which are extreme way of, not extreme way because slavery, but still one of the extreme ways that we have today of commodified labor. So Wood and colleagues from the Oxford Internet Institute, they tried to reconcile these two notions, normative and network embeddedness, by looking at gig economy and online labor. What they concluded is that network embeddedness is closer to understanding how work gets done, while normative disembeddedness is important to understand the conditions under which the work is done and the risks that it may represent to social reproduction. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk about the different ways in which network embeddedness and normative disembeddedness are configured in the case of data annotation platforms. So now let's go to the matter here. Like this describe my ongoing field work. So how is data annotation outsourced? Usually platforms use two different types of outsourcing services. We're going to focus on one of them. One of them is business process outsourcing. The other one is digital labor platforms. And for today's talk, we're going to focus exclusively on digital labor platforms. When I started looking at digital labor platforms years ago, one of the things that was the most difficult to do research was to know who the workers are, where they are, how can we reach to these workers to ask questions about their working conditions. So far, what we have was this, the findings from the GeoNet project, again, from the colleagues from the Oxford Internet Institute, who mapped the availability of online workers for freelancing platforms. So freelancing platforms are, for example, platforms like Upwork and a Freelancer, where you can pay for services such as transcriptions, designing. So it's not quite, some of these platforms provide this services of data annotation, but it's not quite the same. There are some platforms which are the ones that are the focus of this talk that are exclusively about annotating data for machine learning. So as you can see, this availability of online workers was too broad in scope for the purpose of the research. So I had to conduct research about the web traffic of these, on the web traffic of these selected platforms. And my findings are actually very similar to, in some ways, to the findings from the GeoNet project. So as you can see from the GeoNet project, most of the workers come from the United States, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and the Philippines. And these are my findings from web traffic from last year. Some of the countries that I previously mentioned are still there on the top, United States, India, Philippines. But here you can see there is a sharp rise of Venezuela in terms of percentage of the population. Now, disclaimer. So this is web traffic. Web traffic doesn't mean the same as not even number of accounts or number of users. So I cannot say that these are where the workers come from. This is just where the web traffic of these platforms come from. And I'm saying this because many of the workers that I've been interviewing, they tell me that they use VPNs to access the US market of data annotation. The reason is that many platforms pay more to US workers. Again, if they would pay the same as they pay Venezuelans, I don't think US workers would access this, would work for these services. So they provide higher wages for American workers. So many, this incentivizes many Venezuelans to use VPNs to connect to this, log into this platforms to work for the American market. So that could all, in part, maybe, this is an open question, a question that remains unanswered, explain why the percentage of American workers is so high in the world. Another thing that is a limitation of this data you can see here is that China is not represented. As you might know, the Chinese internet is in some way separate from the rest of the internet. So maybe the measure for the Chinese market is not accurate in here. It could have been that many more workers are working right now in China, but we can know through this web traffic data annotation, through this analysis of web traffic from this marketing services, that this is when the data comes from. But at least you can see there is a increasing, like this, Venezuela here is the second country the most represented. And by looking at my field work, most of the people that I've interviewed that have been interested in answering my questions are from Venezuela. And why is then Venezuela so much represented here in this graphic? So the Venezuelan case is the following. Venezuela, as you may know, is a country in a deep economic, political, and social crisis. And this is, an example of this is the levels of hyperinflation of the country. One of the participants of my research told me that her pension is 1,860,000 bolivars, which is $1 per month. The inflation rate, you can see from this chart, the inflation rate in 2019 spiked at 350,000%. Last year, the average was 3,000%, which is the highest in the world by a huge margin. The second country, I think, is in around 100%. So 3,000% is way more than what other countries are experiencing. What this does, according to my participants, is that it creates an informal market tied to the US dollar. So for example, this woman she's a retired woman whose pension is now $1 per month, she has to work for the platforms full time so she can get access to food and services. For example, a piece of bread can cost $1, half a dozen eggs can cost $1, a kilogram of rice can be $2. So as you can see, even the most basic types of food that you can access in the market, there's still the value is still higher than what this wage or the wage of many people in Bolivars is. So they have to rely on the informal market to do that. Many people tell me they have to start selling things, produce, sell other types of services, and then many people choose these platforms because these platforms provide a low entry barriers, and it's not a very stable, but still an income in dollars they can rely on every week. And then also we have the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic that has exacerbated these issues, making it more difficult for people to find sources of income outside of their homes. So by being stuck at their homes, online platforms are becoming one of the most used sources of income for the people I've interviewed and the families and their close relations. So there are many platforms out there. For the web traffic data set, I surveyed 93 platforms from these 93 platforms, the ones that operate in countries like Venezuela, that I've selected are these three, A, B, and C, which I have anonymized. And the reason I decided to focus on these platforms is because these platforms are exclusively specialized, as I said before, on annotation for machine learning algorithms. There's no all the tasks are about that, that purpose. So I'm going to describe briefly how different are these platforms. They are different in terms of the types of tasks and also the applications that can be used from these tasks. So the first one is platform A. The most common tasks that you can see in platform A are annotation of text, images, and videos. So for example, if you have an image, one of the most common examples of tasks is an image of a house. There's a photo of a house, and then you have to tag or select every single one of the objects according to predefined categories. So for example, chairs, you have to select what are the chairs in this image for the artificial intelligence to recognize the objects of this image. Another one is 2D image classification. So for example, they show you images of dogs and cats, and the worker has to label every image according to the main object of this image. So this is a photo of a dog, this is a photo of a cat, and so on. And the final one is 2D semantic segmentation. I'm going to explain this more in detail in the following slide. So the most common applications for these platforms are content moderation. Content moderation in the sense that many workers are training algorithms that recognize hate speech in chats, for example. Another one is natural language processing algorithms. Many workers are tasked to transcribe for natural NLP algorithms or to input some data to train NLP algorithms. And finally, retail and marketing. Many of these retail and marketing companies are using these tasks. For example, the one about tagging all the objects in an image that can potentially have a use for retail and marketing purposes as well. Then we have platform B. Platform B is mostly focused on Internet of Things devices and self-driving cars. Like most of the tasks in platform B are for self-driving cars. Here there are also text and image video annotations, 2D image classification and segmentation, but especially 3D. 3D is very important for self-driving cars, so the machine learning the artificial intelligence that drives these cars can recognize 3D objects or objects in a 3D setting. And again, I'm going to describe this task more in detail. And the final one is what colleagues Paula Turbot and Antonio Caselli from France and their team called a deep labor platform. It's a platform that is accessed through another platform. So the platform D in this case recruits the workers and assesses the reliability of the workers. And once they assess this and they approve some workers, they invite these workers to apply to access platform C. And platform C is an internal platform for a big tech company. So all big tech companies have an annotation platform, and all big tech companies use these other services to recruit the workers for themselves. And so this creates a new level of secrecy, a new level of security for the platforms. Many workers have to sign a non-disclosure agreements, and this is a way for these platforms to maintain their ongoing projects as secret to the wider public. So this is a big tech company that has a search engine, a very popular search engine, and the task that workers do here is mostly data entry. Enter data for the search engine. So for example, what are the companies that are situated in this city? So you have to input the addresses and so on. And also, and this is unique for these type of platforms, algorithmic verification for the search engine. So many of the workers see the results of the search engine and they have to evaluate the accuracy and the reliability of the results from the search engine. In many cases, they have to compare the same results of a search engine with that of a competitor search engine and assess which one is better and why to help train this search engine. So this is one of the examples of 2D semantic segmentation for self-driving cars. Here you can see an image of a road, and workers have to color every single object of this road according to categories. So you can see the red is for pedestrian, blue is for vehicles, green is for trees, and so on. And this is the example for 3D image annotation. And this is an 3D image from a LiDAR scanner, a laser scanner that maps the surroundings of a vehicle, and the workers have with these cubes that you can see in different colors, annotate the different objects that are present in this 3D image. So with this context, and then reflecting back on the notion of embeddedness that I described before, the research question that I want to answer with my fieldwork for the rest of this talk is the following. How are data annotators and their personal networks affected by the commodification of labor by platforms? And remember that this requires to use the notions of embeddedness or disembeddedness from the point of view of hard polynomy and soft polynomy, from the point of view of people are present in institutions. Transactions in the market don't happen exclusively between individuals, but these individuals are present in a society with its rules, norms, and institutions. But also the networks are important. People rely on their networks to perform these economic transactions. So to explore this, I'm going to talk first about the working conditions of the workers, then the networks and their access to public services and other institutional and governmental services. So first, the working conditions. And each one of these slides will have one of the images of the workplaces of the workers. So working conditions. In practice, platforms consider workers as micro entrepreneurs or freelancers or independent contractors, or other terms that basically mean that workers are completely on their own. The platform does not take any consideration for their rights or for rights, for example, tied to employment that you can see in the International Labour Organization and the United Nations and so on, like minimum wage, protections against child labor, and so on. This doesn't exist because workers are considered exclusively as micro entrepreneurs. The second thing is that payment is as low as 50 cents of a dollar per hour in one platform that used to pay workers per hour. I'm going to talk more about this in a second. But also, for those who are paid per task, in many instances, workers are paid even less than a US cent per task. How do they pay this? Workers have to do 1,000 tasks, so they can be paid like 30 cents, for example. And this is then an example of how wage theft works in this instance. So the next point here is that workers report a reduction in wages and instances of wage theft. So one way in which wage theft operates in this platform is that workers have to complete a certain number of tasks to be paid, for example, 30 cents. So if you complete half of that, so that labor has been given for free to the platform, and the platform will not pay you until you finish the entire set of tasks that you're supposed to do. Another way when this happens is that workers are paid every week, and after a certain amount of money collected by the platform. Usually it's between $5 or $10, meaning that if you work until you have $9 and your account gets terminated for any reason, the platform will never pay you for that wage, for that labor that you already performed. So with these low wages and so on, how do platforms do for workers to sign in? So many, again, like many other types of platforms in the gig economy or elsewhere, for platforms to become, in practice, what David Niebuhr and some colleagues from the so-called Amsterdam School of Platform Studies say, they have to, for them to become like infrastructures, they have to create strong network effects. And by that, they have to reduce entry barriers, but also provide incentives for users to access the platform. And for workers, that means higher wages. That means, for example, and this is back to the 50 cents per hour, this platform, one of the four I'm analyzing, they used to have until last week, they used to have a program special for Venezuelans, where Venezuelans would sign in just by showing their ID, just to prove that they're from Venezuela, and they would be paid per hour, 50 cents per hour. At the beginning, they used to have also bonifications. And at the beginning, there used to be around 1,000, a few hundred workers doing this. Then when more people relied on this platform, they started reducing the bonifications. Then by December, there were around 8,000 workers. And they started not only reducing the bonifications, but also arguing that the workers were stealing time or stealing money from the platform by, for example, keeping the computer on and just not doing the task and so on. So they were then starting to fire some people from the program until last week. They decided to completely shut the program down. And now everyone is relying on the per task payment. but then by then the platform has become an infrastructure because, as I said, many people are relying on this type of work. Many people are now working full-time for these platforms, and then they shift their livelihoods with this platform to their only source of income. Someone was telling me, if I stop working for, someone with diabetes was telling me, if I start working for these platforms, I would literally die, because this is the only form I can pay for my medical expenses. And I'm going to talk more about the access to healthcare in a moment. So as I mentioned, workers report a reduction in wages and in instances of wage theft. And remember that quote from Karl Marx. We're going to go back to that quote back. That also speaks to that quote. Some workers are also paid in cryptocurrency or gift cards. So for example, this platform that used to have this program paying per task, they would pay workers through an online wallet from a Mexican company. And what happens is that they would be paid in wallets, dollars, or like virtual dollars, not actually dollars, but dollars tied to the wallet. Meaning that when you convert these dollars into actual dollars, there is a commission that the wallet retains. And then the more transactions occur for you to transform this wallet dollars into real dollars, and then into bolivars, and then to money that you can use to buy food, for example, then all those commissions reduce the income of the workers for the profit of all these intermediaries. And finally, some workers are also paid in cryptocurrency. And again, they have to sell this cryptocurrency through many other means until they get money they can spend locally. And again, through commissions, a lot of these wages are reduced. And then the worst type of payment that I've observed is gift cards, where workers are paid in gift cards that are usually Amazon gift cards, only valid in the United States, meaning that workers have to either sell the gift cards locally at a lower price, or buy products in the United States, then ship them to Venezuela and sell them locally again, earning less money from what they're being paid. So this is how the wages actually keep shrinking for workers. And finally, because of how the platform is structured, training and evaluation is required for workers. So for example, if a worker wants to do a certain task, they have to train for this task, then pass some exams, and all this time, the other instances that are paid, is not paid for the workers. Other findings about working conditions is that workers feel they're easily replaceable, and the platform stress this by telling workers that they can be fired at any time. They don't say fired because they're not employed by the platform. They call it as your account will be terminated, your account will be suspended indefinitely. And this usually happens for most of the people I've been talking to. This happens suddenly without recourse as well. Sometimes there's recourse, but it's very difficult to navigate the platform's policies to ask for their accounts to be enabled again. And as I said before, all the work that you've done has remained unpaid will remain unpaid. Someone told me that he lost 2 weeks of wages because his account was terminated and he never knew why. And he another thing is that many of the workers here, they rely on translators to understand the task because they don't speak English. So then they are asked to the platform if they want to have any recourse or ask any question, they have to do emails in English, which they cannot do. So many workers just open another account and work through that account, and they lose all the work that's been done with other accounts. Also, many workers suffer from social isolation due to working from their homes, and also at social hours. Someone was telling me that, a young person was telling me that he had to sometimes wake up at 3 a.m. because there were new tasks, like no tasks throughout the day, and the only ones available would come at 3 a.m. So he had to wake up at 3 a.m. to work for the platform, or to remain just working from early hours in the morning and then go to bed really early, so he could be able to work for the platform, because of the clients being located in other countries when they post these tasks. And if you don't do the tasks quickly, then other workers will do the tasks, and then the availability of tasks will be depleted. Also, the majority of workers have to work at high speed, and then many of them work full-time, and even full-time, not in a, so many times we say, oh, full-time. So in France, full-time is 35 hours a week. Here in North America, full-time is around 40 something hours per week. Many workers actually work way more than that for the platform. And finally, the last slide I have on working conditions is obviously that workers suffer from alienation. They don't know who their employers are, and the majority don't know what their work is for. And this is crucial in a moment where we talk so much about transparency of AI, be transparent and tell where the data comes from, and what the quality of the data is. So here is our workers who are told to do things, but they don't know what to do. And for an upcoming paper for the A&M Institute that's going to be published in June, I'll argue that this has then ethical implications because workers are tasked to do things that they're, from their point of view, they're not ethical for them to do. So in this paper, and this is a short essay, I argue that we also need ethics from below because we talk so much about, oh, we need to talk to those who are most affected by the systems. So these people are the ones that's affected by the systems because they're working for the systems already, but they don't have any say on what they're doing or what they're doing, or any say if what they're doing for is actually ethical or not. Then second point here is that third, the interviewed workers don't pay any taxes on their income. The other workers chose not to answer this question. So a lot of workers are actually not contributing to the economy, and the platforms, of course, are not contributing to the economy where the labor comes from. So obviously taxation is also part of the employer here, and the employer here is not paying any taxes or contributing to the economy, local economy of these countries. And finally, while platforms cut intermediaries, the reputation scores make workers with higher scores outsource their jobs to newcomers. This was something that I recently saw in one of the forums, someone arguing that someone who was doing re-intermediation of work wasn't paying the worker. And this is something that was also observed by colleagues from the Digital Labor Project at Oxford, who also saw the same with freelancers. So this is something that was observed in freelancing platforms in Africa and Asia that I've observed that someone has argued about this or commented on this on a social media post, but this is something that I need to dig more in and talk more to workers about this. Then, so this was the past slides were about working conditions. This is now about reliance on networks. And what you can see here on the upper right corner, so this graph here is a graph of one of the workers. I'm collecting network data from the workers. This is, for example, a worker who relies economically from the support of their father, aunt, mother, and friend A, and then relies on friends B and C and a colleague for support to their work. So basically, this is a worker who's paid in Amazon gift cards. He relies on friends B and C who live in the United States to receive the products and ship them to his country. This is a Colombian worker, and then colleague helps him sell the products. So what I argue here is that despite the disembedded market, so as you can see, workers are disembedded in the sense that, in the Harpolani sense, in that their labor is commodified and that they're considered as like micro entrepreneurs or freelancers. Workers are, however, embedded in local networks of trust. Many of these workers rely on their family members, on their friends, on their neighbors for different types of support, ranging from emotional support, economic support, domestic labor, and other types of support. Many workers also participants discovered or recommended the platforms to the networks. That's how they started working, and also how many of their personal relations are also working for the platforms. And as I said, types of support include emotional, financial, and domestic. And also workers have organized themselves through social media. And this is on the lower right corner. You can see this is a Discord group that has a bot that tells the workers when the tasks are being posted. So remember that I said that a worker was waking up at 3 a.m. to do tasks? It's because this young worker is part of this group, and the bot will tell the worker, wake up, there are tasks available. And so that's why people pay to be like $1 or $2, $3 per month to be part of these groups, and also to receive advice, to receive other types of benefits, and also to contribute to the group, helping others perform tasks or do them in a better way to have higher income. Now, the present of institutions, and you've been seeing many computers so far, and maybe this one that I've shown, this is the second time I've shown this computer. What is this computer? What is this Canaima computer? So this computer is actually a computer made in Venezuela from money, from taxpayer money. This is from a government company. And this computer was made for school children back in the days and years where Venezuela was relying on the income from oil. So they created this publicly funded company to create computers, and all these computers, which are called the Canaima, and this model is called Canaima Red Letters. These were distributed to school children for free. And then when the crisis occurred, many people started selling these computers, and there's a market of these computers in Venezuela. Many of the workers I've interviewed, many of them are working with computers that they bought on this market that are Canaima computers made by the state. So what I'm arguing here is that the role of the state was fundamental to create infrastructures that have made Venezuela such a viable country for these platforms to operate. There is internet infrastructure, there are computers there. All this infrastructure was built from public funds. However, because of the economic crisis that the country is suffering right now, this infrastructure has become unreliable. So for example, workers, those who are in Venezuela, they have access to electricity, water, not internet, but electricity and water, and these are free. These are free paid by the state. However, they're very unreliable. Water services, for example, are usually shut and people have access to them a few days per week. Many of them don't even have access to water. And I'm going to talk about my third point here about what they do. And then electricity also comes and goes. So for example, and for the internet, that's a paid service, but still it's also unreliable. So for example, many workers have to wake up very early in the morning, like around 4 a.m. to have access to the internet, and then work until 10 a.m. when the internet slows down because a lot of people are then connected to the internet. Same happens with electricity, and that makes the job more difficult for them because without electricity, there's no income. And in many cases, platforms are the only source of income. So support from the government has also been reduced. They receive, for example, many workers receive so many workers are from lower income backgrounds. Many of them still receive some subsidies, but it's, for example, subsidies in terms of one package of food every month, or a few dollars every week, every few weeks. So it's not enough for them. And this is the only type of support they receive. There is no healthcare insurance. They have to pay from their pockets all the expenses of healthcare. Many workers still may prefer not to get sick. If I get sick, I just stay at home. If it's something that I really need a doctor, I would ask a friend if they know a doctor to come to my house, because they try not to rely on hospitals, public hospitals. The same with education. Many kids are now at home, working at home, studying from their homes. And what happens is that, remember those images of the kids and women doing garments a century ago? Many workers have told me that they've seen kids working for these platforms as well. These platforms usually try not to be available. I mean, they say they're not available for minors, but what they do, some of these kids, what they do is that they, for example, present the ID of a family member who's an adult, open the account on the name of that family member, and just work for the platform. And some people have told me, hey, I've seen kids as little as 12 years old working for these platforms. So again, this embeddedness of the market allows for the exacerbation of social inequalities. So my last point here is that community and neighborhood support is essential to manage some common resources. And an example of that is water. Many of the workers who don't have reliable access to water, they have pumps, local pumps, regulated by the community as a common resource. And they all regulate these pumps, and that's how they have access to water. So in the instances when the state is diminished, in many cases collapsed, these networks expand to the community as well, and these workers then rely on this community and neighborhood support to share and take care of these common resources. So here is the conclusion from Wood et al. Study on disembeddedness. They argue that despite labor being embedded within interpersonal networks, it was simultaneously disembedded from the culture and legal norms that would limit it. This is a typo there. And that's also what I've concluded after this part of my presentation, is that yes, people depend on their social networks and interpersonal networks, that embedded in these networks, and these networks expand towards their communities as well, in the case, for example, of caring for shared resources, but then they're also disembedded from the protection of the state, the protection of the platforms as employers of these workers. So the disembeddedness of this and the commodification of this labor, this embeddedness of this market, causes workers to rely even more on their personal networks, so to be embedded in their personal interactions. And let's go back then to this quote from Marx. As you can see, piece wages become, from this point of view, the most fruitful source of reductions of wages and capitalistic cheating. So remember how the bonifications were reduced, the wages were reduced, and there was a lot of wage theft on the platforms. Hierarchically organized systems of exploitation and oppression, how the platform as the middleman, the intermediary, relies and organizes these systems of economic exploitation. And then obviously the job of the middleman here, the platform, in well, Marx calls it interposition of parasites, but how the platform here structures the market for the income of these platforms and not for the social benefit of these workers. And then the final point, and now I'm entering the final part of my presentation, is about future research. And the final part of Marx was talking, so Marx before talked about domestic labor, but here the exploitation of the labor by the laborer. And here I want to make a point of Polanyi and how Polanyi relates embeddedness to social reproduction. Remember that social reproduction is not the main topic for this talk, but it's still related. And this is what Polanyi says about social reproduction. Labor power cannot be shoved about, used indiscriminately, or even left unused without affecting also the human individual who happens to be the bearer of this particular commodity. Remember, humans as embodied entities. In disposing of a man's labor power, the system would incidentally dispose of the physical, psychological, and moral entity man attached to the tag. So, I mean, the idea that labor is a fictitious commodity because these are human beings with human rights have to live a dignified life. And this is when social reproduction comes about. And I'm going to describe how I'm going to, for future research, explore social reproduction. Just basically social reproduction, reproduction of inequalities in capitalism is usually studied in two ways, from the French Bourdieusian perspective of inequalities and the Marxist feminist perspective of domestic labor, reproductive labor. I'm trying to, so my future work here is trying to bring those together and study, for example, the biases in this, not biases, but going beyond biases and talking about injustices and inequalities, social inequalities in this platform. So, like, one of the questions of my future work is how do the organization and operation of data annotation platforms contribute to the reproduction of social inequalities in artificial intelligence? And this is work that I'm currently doing with my colleague, Milagros Micheli from the Weizenbaum Institute. We're looking at these, for example, instructions that instruct workers to, this is what the workers do actually. This instruction is saying, you will see faces of people, you have to categorize this according to gender, and these genders are male, female. There is an other category, but this is not for other genders. This is if you just don't find a face, there's no face in the box. So you can see our work with Milagros, it says that, argues that these instructions come from worldviews that are then, because of how the labor is structured, workers have little agency, and then the worldviews of those who write these instructions are the ones embedded into the data sets. So it's a top-down imposition of worldviews that contributes to these reproductions and inequalities in artificial intelligence. And then another one, so this is more tied to the Bourdieusian idea of social reproduction as inequalities. And then the other idea of social reproduction as domestic and reproductive labor tied to networks. So for this research, my question is, how are communities of data annotators and their shared resources configured and organized? And I'm very interested. Remember the example of Bhattacharya that I said, that some people who look into labor, they care about what happens between 9 to 5, like the job at the office. What social reproduction invites is to look what happens from 5 to 9, what happens when workers live, who does the domestic labor, who takes care of these workers, and so on. So this is another zero-made research that I'm planning to do. And finally, the more applied part of it, the part that I would say will make a lot of computer scientists happy, is what do we do with this? How can we make this better? And there are many ways to do this. There's no panacea here. There's no way of improving this. But what I want to do and work with other colleagues about is to evolve this current idea of evaluation and documentation. This is an example of model card. One great example of saying, hey, you have your data set, but tell us where this data set comes from. Tell us more details about the model, why are you going to use the model for, and so on. What I want to do is to improve these data sets and include the workers as well. So the question here is, how can we make AI models that are transparent and respectful of human rights, and human rights including those rights of the workers that, remember at the beginning, the anatomy of an AI system? How can we make sure that the models, the AI models, respect the human rights of these individuals? And I think that there are many ways to address these issues. An example is, for example, evaluating platforms. This is what the Fair Work Institute is doing. But from my personal research, what I want to do is to also work with this documentation initiatives that have been done that don't talk at all about workers. And I want to bring workers as humans with human rights then require dignified life into these models to make models and AI more transparent, and also striving for social justice and reducing inequalities in the future. And this is the end of my talk. Thank you very much for your time.